in America especially, one of the arguments that's made against Muslims and Islamics is that religious freedom is not allowed in Islamic countries, where it is allowed in Christian or American type countries or Western societies. So I'm just wondering how much truth there is to this and how you'd respond to it. Anyone here?
Do you want me to be slightly different? Or you can, or if you want.
Don't jump.
Okay, I hear that argument a lot. Sometimes it's said there's no churches allowed to be built in Saudi Arabia as an instance. It's not actually historically or accurate in any way. If you take a look at Saudi Arabia, I mean, the idea that America is a place of liberty and diversity and so forth, if you contrast it, it's very different ways of how they work things. If you look at Saudi Arabia, there's literally enclaves that are just for Westerners, where law is suspended, where local law no longer applies in that place, and it's militarized, protected, and you can do what you want in those enclaves.
Wow.
Now, there are different ways globalization works, and the market shapes the way communities of diversity come together. But if we were to contrast, to ask the question differently rather than count mosques and churches, imagine an area, enclave here, just Sharia, protected by military, extracting your natural resources and taking it back home. That's a type of tolerance that we would never have. So yes, there are differences, and I'm not defending Saudi Arabia as a liberal democracy of multiplicity and whatnot, but it seems that there are different political ways, and to suggest that the West or Europe, or call it what you want, has no entry point into developing the third world is to ignore maybe, 4 centuries of politics.
I mean, just building on that, I think the other point to make about enclaves, which is maybe taking it slightly away from your original question, but it does build on something that Jock said, which is about one of the major fears that those who deem multiculturalism to be a failure have, is that it's leading, as the head of the former Commission for Racial Equality in the UK, Trevor Phillips, called, to society sleepwalking to segregation. And what he meant was that there were these people from ethnic minorities who didn't want to integrate, who didn't want to be part of society at large. Now, there are a couple of statisticians at Manchester University who actually went and did some research into this. And what they found was that the greatest majority of people who could be said to have self-segregated, that is, chosen not to live with people who were different to themselves, were white people. Not only because they represent the great majority of the population, but also because they actively sought to live amongst themselves. That it's actually not physically possible for a person of colour in Australia or in the UK not to interact with white people. It just simply isn't possible. How would you go about doing it? There's no way you can do it. Be it at school, at work, in the health system, wherever else. So this notion that people are choosing to segregate is actually a misnomer.
You seem to say that bigotry or racism is not natural. Maybe I misunderstood you. Is that correct or is that not? Have you ever watched children at play? Children at school picking on the other? Is that not racism?
No, it isn't. When I spoke about people assuming that racism is universal and general, this is what I meant, that there's a confusion or there's a conflation between fear and hatred of the other and intolerance of the other and something called racism. And we have to actually decouple these two things. So the whole idea of race, which doesn't come on the agenda of the word, I mean, I don't want to give you a whole potted history of the history of race, but it doesn't come on board until the end of the 17th century in the way that we use it today. And it comes on board under very specific historical contexts that many of you will be familiar with. And it gets used in the context of imperialism and colonialism in order to establish a system of justification for basically either causing genocide against people who were constructed as racially inferior, or taking their land, colonizing their land, and as I said before, capitalizing on their resources. Okay, and then it gets used in various different ways, including under contemporary regimes of migration in order to establish various ways in which people have access to resources. So the White Australia policy is a good example of how racism gets used to exclude people from the construction of the Australian nation. Now, that is completely different to simply not liking somebody else or having some kind of bigotry towards them. There is no underlying theory or concept for making sense of that intolerance. And the way I explain this to my students is, let's say a family moves in next door to you, and the same people have lived there for 20 years, and you're kind of a little bit suspicious of these new people who've moved in next door, and you decide to give them the benefit of the doubt, and you go around and you introduce yourself, but it turns out that they're very nice people. Okay, so basically your original fear of those people is completely shifted through the meeting with them. Now, if racism is at play, the belief that those people are reducible to the idea that you already have of them, so the pre-constructed idea that you already have of them, means that you will be unable to shift your opinion of them. Okay, so that's the difference in terms of how, when race comes into play, and the difference between that and prejudice or bigotry.
But that assumes that people do not change. Sorry, that's what you seem to be saying.
That's fine.
No, I'd like to divorce racism from individual attitudes. Okay, I don't think that talking about racism as individual attitudes helps us in any way to understand how race comes into play in terms of creating structures of exclusion and discrimination.
If I understand what you were saying, Alana, it is that Islamophobia is simply a form of racism and is pretty much the same in character as previous forms of racism. So what I want to ask is, why does it appear that racism, and the two targets in Australia, of course, are asylum seekers and Muslims, often linked together? Why is racism in Australia, and indeed in most Western countries, on the increase again? Is it something that lies in the characteristics of the majority population that they feel a need to be racist? And if so, I mean, I agree with the arguments about past colonialism and so on, but why is it that people today feel a greater need to attack minorities than perhaps they did 10 or 20 years ago? Why was there a period when multiculturalism was moving towards acceptance, not only in Australia but in many other countries? And why has that changed in the last 5 to 10 years? What is different now from in the past?
I'll just have a quick go at that one. That's a tough question. I mean, I'm not sure you can argue that racism is on the increase. I mean, there's no doubt that there are many instances now of right-wing parties, anti-immigration parties, and whatever, and there are many instances of individual attacks on mosques or on synagogues or whatever. So that's certainly true. I'm not sure, though, that that necessarily constitutes an increase in racism. I think that would be an interesting project about how you would actually measure that. Nevertheless, it is true that there's very fertile ground for that, for racism. And it seems to me part of that is in the anxieties and insecurities post the global financial crisis. Partly it's got what Standing calls, the precariat, that people are now moving to precariat working lives, that no one really has a permanent job that they can see having all the time, that people are moving to very much casual work. Most of the new jobs created are casual. This is not only happening in Australia, it's happening globally. It's got partly to do, I suppose, with generational changes, and our friend Tony Abbott talks about generational theft, which I don't like the way in which he uses that, but there are issues about generational disadvantage happening. So it seems to me that the way I would look at, if racism is indeed on the increase, and I'm not quite sure if that's the case, but if it is, then I would argue that it's the insecurities of contemporary capitalist life, or contemporary life in general, that make us much more insecure and anxious. And that anxiety, it seems to me, finds, a bit like water finds its lowest level, anxiety finds the prejudice and the xenophobia sometimes as some sort of security about sort of how to, how to live and at least feel better than someone else.
In terms of tonight, we've had an intellectual discussion about a topic. The gentleman in the middle, pardon not knowing your name, I didn't hear it in the beginning. My question is, you mentioned, but you didn't get into detail, that we cannot understand what's happening in, for example, say the Middle East or with Islam today without having an awareness of the history, the background to what's going on. My question to you is as follows. When we have a discussion on intellectual level, we can agree to agree or we can agree to disagree. However, one of the reasons why there is a lot of people starting to challenge both from within Islam and outside Islam is the idea of when you start to use violence or you're resorting to violence, that actually starts taking that discussion to another level. So my question is, whether you're from within Islam or from outside Islam, at what point do we go from having a discussion on a concept to one where we can actually use violence and actually challenge people to the point where it's irreversible, as opposed to we can actually grow together and take it from there?
There's two parts to your question. The first one was about the role of history in our conversations, and the second one is about how do we confront violence. Yes.
How do we go to an environment where it's purely an intellectual discussion and we discuss issues at the core, whatever they may be, without any fear of reprisals or violence? For example, if we challenge, say, Allah or Muhammad, for example.
How do you criticise me without me beheading you?
Without being,
I did bring my sword today, so that's something.
Anyway, it's classic.
Well done. The first issue about history. Okay. What I meant by that, it's in contrast to so much of the conversation. So, for example, off the top of my head, there were times when we explained what was going on in Iraq as a Sunni v Shia split. They hate each other, so they're at war. We would never, intuitively, by nature of where we've been brought up and our education, never reduce World War II to a war between the British and the Germans don't like each other. Yeah, they're just different people. There is a history that has shaped modern day Iraq, there's a history that shaped Kuwait, there's a history that shaped Iran, and so many. One of the white privileges that has come out of this conversation is the right to narrate without knowing somebody's history. Yeah? And I'm highlighting that point. So it was also in respect to criticisms of ISIS, of course, but know the history of Iraq. There was a moment sometime last year where we were talking about homegrown terrorists and radicals a week or two after Gaza was bombed. And so little voices connected dots between radicalization. To put it this way, some did, but a lot more were like, this imam, this sheikh is radical and he's infecting the youth. Those dots were connected, circular dots. Islam's problem creates its own problem. And all I'm saying is that there's a necessity, if we are to engage in political debates, to recognize the formation of political forms of societies. And I go back to my initial point, as a young Muslim growing up in Australia, I am forced to confront my history. And it is difficult. It is not rosy. I'm not here to celebrate it, but I have to articulate it. And it becomes increasingly difficult to articulate when everybody thinks they know it.
Good question.
And the violence issue. Okay, there is an assumption here that I'll go back to the definition of racism. Racism is violence. It is an objective violence. We're interpreting racism here through cognitive individual agencies. This may sound somewhat strange, but it may not. The economy is racist, insofar as much as it determines where wealth is distributed based on colonially formed pathways. Yeah, that's a form of violence. And violence that we speak about, that we recognize so intuitively and are disgusted by, are the subjective ones that hit our media, the groups. But that also has to be put in the position of recognizing the violence of colonialism, the violence of foreign policies. And, I mean, I may take it a lot further. I think Alana shares this point as well. Modernity is violent for a lot of people, and only a few have been privileged by it. So I come from a world where violence is, and I mean, not really. I grew up in North Sydney. 1 year. All right, you have to play up that identity, right? I've spoken too long, but I hope the point was made. Thank you.
Islamophobia is quite a frightening thing to someone of Jewish background like myself, and indeed I experienced it. My big worry is if economy gets worse, that's when usually racism and scapegoating gets worse. Is it likely to be exploited more if our economy gets worse?
The answer is yes.
Next question.
I'm an anti-Zionist activist and referred to as an anti-Semite a lot of the time, even though a lot of my heroes are Jews. And I always say cheers to all the good, moral and ethical Jews out there who are ashamed of the Zionist Jews and their actions. But I'd just like to add, I'm not a Muslim, I'm an agnostic.
Question, please.
But through my years of research, I've noticed that the war on terror is in fact a war on Islam. The leader of ISIS, Mr. Baghdadi, is in fact Jewish. The leader of Al-Qaeda, or spokesman Mr. Perlman, is Jewish. The Link Cafe terrorist, Mr. Mons, was taken off the terrorist watch list for 3 years, even though he was a red-hot troublemaker. Even after his wife was stabbed and burned to death, which the police would usually bug the main suspect, 30 seconds, but they didn't bother with Mr. Mons. As well, the Charlie Hebdo terrorists were taken off the terrorist watch list 6 months before the act. So my question is to the whole panel, whoever wants to answer, do you believe the war on terror is one-sided and actually seems to be a war on Islam?
Well, apart from your unnecessary anti-Semitism in the middle, and conspiracy theories that are completely irrelevant, and I'm saying this as an anti-Zionist Jew, okay? But I will still not tolerate, just as we're not here to tolerate racism and Islamophobia, we're not also here to tolerate spurious conspiracy theories about Jews. However, I do...
Good and bad in every mob.
All right. Let her finish. Go ahead.
There is something to be said for the idea that the war on terror is anti-Islam from the point of view that Muslim people, both at home and abroad, and Gargi Bhattacharya has spoken about wars on our doorsteps, so this is when the war on terror is taken into people's backyards and into their homes, wherever they may be, has targeted Muslim people more than it has targeted other people. But it also, and this is where race comes into play, plays on the racial profiling whereby people are traveling while brown, for example, and are identified or misidentified as Muslim, which creates a very serious problem for solidarity. We saw recently in the case, I was just discussing this today, in the case of an Indian grandfather, you may have heard of this case, who went to visit his grandchildren and his son and daughter in the United States and was having a walk outside his house, and he was suspected by a neighbour of being, quote-unquote, a skinny black guy up to no good. And this person called the police, and the police came and basically got this guy who didn't speak a word of English, and the only thing he could say was no English, and they put him down on the floor and they handcuffed him and they beat him to death, and he now has broken several vertebrae and he's near death in the hospital, 57-year-old grandfather. And what was pointed out was very interesting in the aftermath. Nobody was denying the fact that this person should never have been treated in the way that he was. But because of the way in which racism and Islamophobia and various intersecting forms of racism work in places like the United States, the Indian community in the United States, the official Indian community, went out of its way to say that this person was not black and not Muslim, and therefore should not have been treated in this way. Okay, so think about how race works, not only to discriminate and injure and cause violence, talking about violence against individual people and groups, but also to create these schisms and between people, so that the only way in which you can position yourself within a racist society like the United States or Australia is to distance yourself as far as possible from the most vilified group, which in the case of the United States is African Americans, and in the case of Australia is Aboriginal people, and every place has its group at the bottom of the pile.
I'd like to know, do you have any idea of the percentage of believers in Muhammad? That's the best way I can put it. What's the percentage of actual believers in the Muhammad within the Muslim community in Australia? Have you any idea? That's my... Are there any figures on that? Because I presume there must be some who are not believers.
Clarify what you mean by believers in Muhammad.
Or who actually believe in Islam, who actually as a religion, as a religion.
I don't have a statistic.
Okay, all right. Well, it just leads on to my next very quick question. How do you think the Muslim people in Paris felt about the I Am Charlie rally? Okay. And how do you think, because I was really interested in how many people really did believe in the religion of Islam, how would they feel that this was actually a stand? I mean, I know they were standing against the terrorists, but how did they actually feel about the actual cartoon? And the reason I'm asking is there was a wonderful article in the Sydney Morning Herald only about 2 weeks ago, which was written very quickly by a believer Muslim who said, we are poor, we are locked out of employment, we haven't got much to really hang on to. What a lot of us hang on to is our religion, our faith, as Christians do. And when we see this sort of, support for that type of cartoon, which we see as mockery, it's very hurtful to us. And that point of view is not being put across in the press. So I'd just like your comments on that.
Yeah, in respect, I think there's two aspects to the cartoon itself.
Yes.
It is offensive, but it's also the intent to offend and the intent to target. And in the context of a war on terror, in the context of a colonial past where France and the Maghreb have a series of unequal relationships, I think that it's quite irrelevant at times how religious you are, because it's a relationship of power designed to harm, relegate, and inevitably commentate on the inferiority of key aspects of who you are. But Alana knows a lot more about France than I do, so maybe
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. I don't think that your degree of religiosity has anything to do with whether or not you were offended by the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm not a religious Jew, but I'm offended by anti-Semitic caricatures or conspiracy theories about Jews that we have already been treated to this evening. What I think is in terms of the problem that you got at when you asked what did Muslims think about the I Am Charlie protests, okay? What I think they felt is exactly the kind of thing that Yasser was trying to articulate without me trying to put words into his mouth. What one thinks of the actual cartoon is kind of irrelevant to the position that you're forced to take if you are a Muslim in France or anywhere else.
If I could just make a brief comment about the Charlie Hebdo thing. It seemed to me that I was a bit disturbed about a couple of elements. One is, I almost thought there was like a bit of freedom. We all want freedom of speech, but that's very much a George Brandis line. We want freedom to be bigots.
That's right.
And I do think that a lot of people find a lot of that stuff offensive. I mean, if I was a Muslim, I would find that offensive. So, and I also thought there was a lot of hypocrisy there. I mean, there are a lot of world leaders who wouldn't give anyone freedom of speech. People think about the people who are the whistleblowers and all sorts of other people who have sort of been incarcerated, including the guy who was sort of found not guilty today, David. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy about freedom of speech, and I think we need to have a bit of a more complex view about the rights of people. And I thought that got sort of lost in the understandable sort of emotion of the reaction. It somehow sort of washed over a lot of the complexities we need to think about.
Sorry, very quickly. I just want to make a big issue's been made about the offensive nature of the cartoons. Undoubtedly, people are offended. But I just want to add the point that sometimes there is this archetypical caricature of the Muslim puritanical can't take satire and criticism and is ultimately governed by being offended. I think that may or may not be true, but I doubt it. My point is here that I'm not offended. It's precisely the role it plays in the broader narrative that is concerning. I'm not offended. I don't care what people have negative views of me. If I'm in a position of power, you can have negative views of me. The point is the negativity is constructed and sewed and stitched into a war and terror narrative. And that's the concern. I mean, it's not so much I'm just offended because it's something sacred to me. I speak on my behalf here alone, but it's often reliant on this caricature of a puritanical, closed-minded, intolerant Muslim who can't take a joke. I take jokes really well.
Okay, this evening started off with the mention of the name Rupert Murdoch. And it hasn't been mentioned, and I'm quite surprised, and you're knowing a lot about Paris. The city of Paris is going to sue Fox Sport, right? For talking about no-go zones around Paris where it was Muslim controlled and no white people could go. Is this an icebreaker?
Good question.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, of course it's not true. I lived in Paris for 16 years.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
absolutely not true.
Oh,
And so the city of Paris itself is suing Fox Sport,
Yeah.
which is controlled by Rupert Murdoch. So are the shop jobs going to be much more controlled in the future when they start talking bullshit?
Well, one would hope so.
Yeah.
But I think there's a wider point to be made about this assumption I always get from my students. So it's the media, isn't it? You know, if we didn't have this racist media, or we didn't have Rupert Murdoch, then we wouldn't have the problem. And I just don't think that that's really the case. I mean, of course they exacerbate the situation, but I think if it was only to do with the racist media wanting to capitalise on racist attitudes, then we could solve the problem quite easily, because then everybody would be opposed to them and we'd all shut them down. I think the point is that Yasser rightly mentioned that racism is in the economy.
Yeah.
So we can't see these two things as being isolated from each other. Racist media exists because race as a structure already exists. Okay? And racism as a means of domination and exploitation already exists. The racist media is an expression of that.
Well, I mean, absolute media lies start wars. So there must be a line that is being drawn now when a whole city is suing.
To answer your question, I don't see it as a game changer or an icebreaker. Throughout racism's long history, people of colour have gains when two powerful white institutions go against each other.
Yeah.
So when I can be protected in this sense, the Council of Paris feels like it's gaining losses by the actual, it's a bit like your point, the drumming up that Muslims are taking over. Please do not brand us that way. Yeah. We know that Muslims are not a good selling point, so don't brand us that way. So I don't see it as, and this is now an attack against a media institution. There's plenty, throughout history, plenty of people have gained, people of colour have gained, insofar as much as they've chosen the right white side, to put it that way. Now, that still means power lies outside of that. And when I hear game changer, I mean a better distribution of power.
Carl Schmitt once said that all political concepts in the West are secularized religious concepts. And he was writing in the context of the West trying to secularize its politics and make it a private issue rather than a public issue. Now there's a really complex history of that within the West, and religion has a really sort of awkward place within that across all spectrums of politics in reactionary and progressive kind of ways. The context in Australia includes, I guess, an Aboriginal sense of the sacred, as well as a Muslim sense of the sacred, and many other senses of the sacred. And I use sense of the sacred instead of religion, because that brings a whole nother kind of baggage of categories and whatnot. Is part of the racism of Islamophobia about liberal democracies, awkwardness, embarrassment, paranoia about the sacred.
It's very close to my thesis, and something similar to the question that was asked before about the visibility of religion. I'll put it this way.
I've been in a few courtrooms in my time, and if you look at the crest that's in the courtroom in courtrooms in New South Wales, it says "By God on my right."
Yeah. I mean, this is part of the point. It amazes me, for somebody who's been in a lot of Muslim countries, how much of what you may call Christendom has influenced secular liberal culture and kind of recedes into the background as the norm. So while I was at Melbourne University, I was the president. We were trying to get a prayer space, and they said we're a secular university and we don't want any religious symbols. So you walk around the campus, it's all churches. And if you take it to the philosophical point of view, that which informed liberalism is deeply and intrinsically tied to a Christianized history or a Judeo-Christian history, dealing with even to the point of the subject, the idea of human kind of confined. So when speaking about over-visibility of religion, I'll put it this way, it's actually the over-visibility of the other's religion. And in that sense, I like your question, because the secularization is, in a sense, trying to make, in kind of race theory, use the word whiteness, that which assumes neutrality and norms, objectivity, sits in the background. And from that position, that's when we begin to count how many brown people are on the street, because they stand out as an excess of that background. So that's a partial answer.
I just wanted to add something to that. I think maybe there is a problem with the sense of the sacred, but I don't think that there's a problem with religion of the right kind. And this kind of flows into the notion of the separation between good and bad diversity that Gavin and I wrote about in The Crisis of Multiculturalism. We can have diversity if it's of the right kind, and if it adds to white experience. So good diversity is stuff like having more interesting food to eat, okay? And within that, there's also some kind of cultural practices and religious practices that we don't mind. So we don't mind Buddhism, okay? And we don't mind, we're not the violent kind of Buddhism, we don't know about that kind, okay, that oppresses people, but, the kind of the meditation stuff, we don't mind that. And we don't mind a bit of Bollywood dancing, and things that might evoke some gods, but they're a little bit, not really sure, they're nice and colourful. But we don't want it to be stepping over a certain line. And I find it always really interesting to know what happens when you make the kind of point that Yas has been making about how Christianity is ubiquitous. Because you'll have people say things like, and this is being said, my partner is sitting here and he can attest to this, people say, oh, so you celebrate Diwali or you celebrate Passover. Oh, but are you very religious? And we'll say, well, you celebrate Christmas. And they say, oh, but that's just for the children. And Passover is not for the children. I'm a Jewish mother, for God's sake. It's all about the children, right? You guys know this, right? But somehow it's weird and excessive. It's bad diversity. And I think we always have to bring ourselves back to that sense of the kind of thing we have no problem with, and the type of religion we have no problem with, and the type of religion that suddenly becomes problematic. I mean, there's one word: school chaplaincies.
Oh,
right?
Yes.
Last question.
I've got a very quick question. Islamophobia, I think, has not really been defined tonight. Is it just a fear of Islam, or is it an irrational fear of Islam? It appears to be a new word. When did it come into our language?
It was first brought about in the 20s, 30s, something like that. Ironically, by Muslims as well, to describe their fear of religious theocratic states. It takes certain shifts. 20s, 30s, yeah. It takes certain shifts. It becomes salient and very popular 70s, 80s, and then of course it's like a watershed moment for a lot of theists. There was the Gulf War, the Rushdie Satanic Verses case, and Runnymede Trust wrote a Islamophobia challenge for us all, and they defined it as an unfounded hostility towards Muslims based on closed views. But most theorists today, it's a very narrow view. Islamophobia is simply racism. It's just a particular type, it's racism. And Alana's made the point, I don't want to over-talk, but it doesn't matter if Muslims quote-unquote race, because race itself is a construct.
Sorry, Alana, could you just clarify your statement about school chaplains?
Well, my point is that there's no problem with having religious education in schools of a particular kind.
Okay, cool.
So that's all I'm saying. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that we don't like religions of the wrong kind, but we do like religions of the right kind. We're willing to take an enormous part of the money out of the budget and put into school chaplaincies, but we're,
Yeah, okay.
I think it's a point that most people can
just
agree
because I've been a school chaplain for the last 4 years in Far North Queensland, and I guess just to clarify, I know that, well, previous to the previous announcement that Tony Abbott made, that it was open for all religions to be a part of the school chaplaincy program, and even if you were associated with a Christian organisation, you still were really encouraged by Education Queensland to support everyone of all faiths in your school community, which as a chaplain I did for sure. And yeah, I don't know, I just want to clarify what you meant by that.
Question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could it work the other way around? Could a Muslim chaplain say I'm open to all faiths?
I don't know. I assume that they could say that, but I don't know.
No, I think if that would
It all depends on your school administration.
Absolutely. I'm just saying, like, when you consider how much hysteria has come around from halal biscuits, the idea that your children are being schooled and have a chaplaincy who's Muslim and taking care of your Christianity or your Judaism, I'm pretty sure that would hit some headlines.
Absolutely. I guess I wasn't trying to make it a big deal. I just was asking for clarification. Yeah. No, cool. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this brings to an evening, a very special evening. We've had challenges to our beliefs, our biases, and it's been done extremely well by our 3 speakers tonight. And I want you to wish them a happy appreciation for their efforts.